everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today I want to talk about power exchange relationships, and what I have to say here may shock you if you followed my channel for any length of time. I've made probably dozens of videos about DS at this point, covering everything from contracts to punishments to rules, and I'm here to tell you today that you, really all of us in the community, may have the wrong idea about all of those things and how necessary they are. What do I mean? Well, it's sort of a long story. Half a year ago, I made a video talking about the one big secret behind BDSM. I recommend watching it if you haven't yet, but the brief summary of that conclusion there is basically this. Stop doing your kink fixed to the train tracks. Don't feel like you have to go down the exact same route everyone else before you has, simply because that's the way things are done and that's the way BDSM has to be. It's okay to take a pause, step off those tracks, and go exploring in the kinky, wild blue yonder for yourself. As long as you've got the basics of consent and communication down, it's not nearly as scary as you might assume. And what I want to do here is I want to take that same principle and apply it more specifically to power exchange relationships. The whole process. I want to go through the timeline of a lot of BDSM dynamics, especially the ways we don't talk about that timeline. I also want to go over how things change as your relationship grows and how to end up with a sustainable long-term DS for most people, because that tends to look very different in reality compared to what folks usually expect when they're getting into BDSM. There's actually a trend I've noticed the longer I've been in the kink community for. It's not something that's talked about in books or even in podcasts, and frankly, it's not even something that we have open communication about in private or one-on-one. It's really a well-kept secret. And that secret is people's power exchange relationships tend to degrade over time, for lack of a better phrase. And it's hard to admit that, especially phrased that way. It brings to mind all of the kink-shamey vanilla sentiments that kink is just temporary and it's not a real relationship. It's spice, it's a side dish, but it's not the real thing. That when you fall in love with someone or when you really care about them, eventually your protective instincts will kick in and you won't want to hurt them anymore or be hurt by them. Just think of the ending of 50 Shades, and I'm sorry for doing that to you, but think about it for a second. The way that ends is the power of true love conquers Christian Grey's maladaptive, sadistic tendencies, and that is not a pleasant comparison. But I don't think what really happens is quite like that for kinky folk. Instead, it tends to play out much more like this. You have a couple that's excited to explore power exchange together. Maybe they have some kink experience, maybe they don't, maybe they've been together for a long time, or maybe not, but usually they will do a lot of research together. They find out about things like rules and contracts and protocol and punishments, and all of it sounds exciting and wonderful. They spend weekends hammering out their first couple of rules, maybe putting together a contract too. They each compromise, agreeing to try out each other's kinks. Or maybe everything just ends up sounding so amazing that 90% of their yes, no, maybe checklists end up just being all in the heck yes column. Many of them also come to the table already having a few aces in their back pocket. No, I'm not talking about myself here, but they know about concepts like porch time and conquer me feelings, which can really help with the longevity and health of a relationship. This all makes them feel more confident they can weather the storms of disagreements which will invariably crop up. But that feels like a lifetime away. They slowly build up rules and structure, and slowly they move toward that victory line of kink relationships, total power exchange, or TPE. And maybe they get there one day, maybe they don't. But sometimes, more often than we like to admit, things go sideways somewhere along this timeline. It's not explosive, there's not any overt anger, but one day you realize the spark that once propelled you is gone, or at least it's fading. You ask yourself why you're even doing any of this. Why does this matter? You remember those hobbies you gave up, the after-work sports league, the yoga classes, the crafting night you used to host with your vanilla friends. Those are all gone now, abandoned as you dedicated yourself more deeply to your kink relationship. It seemed so hot at the time, everything else was secondary. The shiny newness that once made your rules and protocol feel so special has worn off, and now they feel more like monotonous work. You wouldn't say it out loud, but it's starting to feel that way. You never really even liked that rule about morning coffee. That was your partner's idea, after all. You wish you could go back to your sewing group and maybe sleep in a little bit during the week instead of making coffee, but if you did that, wouldn't that be the beginning of the end of your DS, your whole relationship? Where do you go from here? This is where the guidebook usually ends. So the answer seems obvious. You stop doing kink or you break up. Sometimes people do both, and that's really sad. This result, though, isn't shocking to me. If you look at the messages we send about power exchange relationships, even within our community, that seems like the logical choice. Spend any time on FetLife and you'll see stories about how someone got into a DS dynamic and never looked back. It was just right. The submissive was happy to do anything and everything the dom wanted them to do. And whatever they didn't like on their own, they learned to like simply because it was their partner's kink. It can seem like if you're a real submissive, or a real dom for that matter, you shouldn't have any regrets or things you miss from the time before kink. It should feel like a magical experience of everything falling into place perfectly, where for the first time in your life you feel settled, content, and happy in a relationship. You would never want anything to change. It's pure daily joy from that point on. And though it's left unstated, the assumption is that if this is right for you, that feeling never goes away. And submissive should always just go along with whatever their partner wants, because if they're truly stubby-wubby, they'll all be able to force themselves into liking it eventually. It's no wonder someone might read those stories, reflect on their current reality, and then conclude, gee, I guess I wasn't really that kinky or submissive after all. Or that dominant for that matter too. But this is not always true. This does not have to be the story. There's a concept from a book called Hot and Unbothered that I want to reference now. This is my very annotated copy, as you can tell. This book is by a relationship therapist, and the majority of the content in here is purely focused on vanilla relationships, though it does make mention of kink as well. But there are a few key gems in here that I've been really wanting to translate into a more explicitly BDSM version. One concept is called differentiation, which is foundational to virtually all kinds of relational therapy. The author didn't invent it, but Yana, who is the author, gives an example in this book about baseball as it relates to differentiation. And I'm going to go ahead and read that now. All right, this is a long one, so buckle up, buckaroos. Imagine you've just had a stellar first date with a new person. They're charming, funny, polite to your waiter, have the most captivating eyes you ever did see, and the dinner conversation flowed like sweet, sweet honey. They text you a couple of days later inviting you to a baseball game. They love baseball. Not only do they find baseball games to be fun and relaxing in that rowdy, energetic kind of way, but it also makes them nostalgic for their childhood when their dad used to coach their little league games. How adorable! Though baseball has never really been your thing, you of course say yes because going to this game certainly won't be torture, and it sounds like a cute date idea. During the game, your date is really in their element. The peanuts are popping, the chants are contagious, and by the end of the 6th inning, you find yourself in Swoon City. It's a regular old falling in love movie montage over here. Dang, you think. This person could stick around for a while. Turns out they do. 6 years later, you've got a kid, a house, and season tickets to these effing baseball games. The bleachers are uncomfortable, the concession food gives you heartburn, and all the yelling gives you a headache. but baseball games have become your relationship's thing. Beyond being a seasonal tradition, it's played a leading role in your how we met story and has created an important place for your partner to connect their past to the present life with you. It's not just baseball, it's emotional, relational, and has become a strong tether between the two of you, especially for your partner. Personally, your patience for baseball ran out a long time ago. Though early in your relationship, you happily bent the rules of your own interests in favor of nurturing all the ways you could connect to this new person. Here, in your established relationship of the present, you'd rather spend the time and energy of these baseball games on your own interests and other relationships with friends, family, and your child. In fact, you're starting to become downright resentful of all this time and money that you're spending on your partner's baseball fanaticism rather than on your own life. When's the last time they spent the equivalent of 6 years of baseball season tickets on you and your interests? You want to bring up the idea of significantly cutting back on your baseball attendance. Or really, in an ideal world, you'd like to stop going altogether, but you're worried about what this might mean to your partner, how they might feel about it, and what this shift could do to your relationship. The truth is that you've never liked baseball, and that at the start of your relationship with this person, you downright exaggerated your interest in it because it felt good to connect and you wanted them to like you. To admit this now might cause strife, a feeling of betrayal, or at the very least, rock your otherwise smooth-ish sailing boat. The unknown repercussions and fear of disconnect from your partner encourage you to stay quiet, and you keep going to baseball games in the name of maintaining the status quo of your relational connection, all the while obscuring your partner's ability to see you thrive in the other areas of your life that you've been neglecting, all in favor of their, not your, love of the game. The differentiation happening in this example is the partner coming to terms with the fact that baseball isn't really their thing, and maybe they aren't happy compromising on their happiness anymore in this area. I think this happens in kink too. After all, compromise is a virtue. Sometimes we can really learn to love our partner's kinks that originally we didn't share. After all, there's so many different kinks out there. But sometimes we don't, and that can eat away at a relationship, especially when it's so foundational. This differentiation is actually the second step in a 4-part model of relational stages, and I want to talk about what those stages are now too. Stage 1 is symbiosis. That can't get enough of you, no couple has what we have, honeymoon phase. Polyamorous circles call this new relationship energy. However you label this fresh relationship phase, you know it when you see it or feel it, and sadly, it's always temporary. This is also the shortest relationship phase. Some relationships continue on after it's done, and some don't. The second is differentiation, the driving force in this chapter and the second relational stage, where each person in the relationship starts to notice more acutely what's different about each of them and often struggles heartily, and usually subconsciously, to either accept, assimilate, or otherwise erase those differences. This is a stage that can last for years, and that some couples make it through and some don't. This is also the stage during which most couples start couples therapy. Stage 3 is exploration, which is pretty self-explanatory. This is the stage where each person in the relationship begins to really explore themselves and what they want individually. This phrase can feel scary, threatening, and destabilizing, as many people in relationships erroneously equate independent thoughts, feelings, desires, and pursuits as an indicator of inevitable separation or a threat to their connection. I mean, imagine how bad it is when it comes to kink relationships then. And finally, 4 is rapprochement. That's a little SAT word for you there. The holy grail of Bader and Pearson's model of relationships. This is when we've made it over the rainbow and over our fears of our differences. In this phase, we are able to embrace ourselves as separate individuals and see our relationship as a thriving force, not in spite of our differences, but because of them. The word Bader and Pearson use often to describe this phase is vitality. And it's really interesting when you try to apply this four-part model to kink relationships, because I think a lot of early kink relationships, especially ones based in power exchange, try to stay in the symbiosis phase as long as possible. They want to stay in that enmeshed state where you feel just perfectly synced and fused together as a unit. In some ways, this is kind of the subliminal promise of DS. If you become dominant and submissive together, you'll be two halves of the same coin, and you'll never have to worry about conflict or difficult feelings again, because you can build rules and structure and protocol so high that those things never have to be a threat again. But people are people, even in power exchange, and no matter if you use its pronouns or not in your DS. Feelings happen. Tastes will change. The compromise that once felt so easy can become a heavy burden. As you learn more about yourself and your kinks, the thing that once seemed like the bedrock of your relationship may not be so important to you anymore. Having honesty about this with a partner from either side of the slash can feel daunting. It can feel like you're saying, actually, I lied about being into all this stuff. And your partner might not receive that message particularly well, but you have to do it. If you want your relationship to survive at all, you have to do this. Because if you don't, it will eat you and your relationship alive. Differentiation is something that must occur, I would say, in over 80% of long-term DS dynamics. Yes, I do think some folks are so compatible that they never have to go through these 4 stages of turmoil at all. And if it does happen, it can also happen on a much smaller scale, and it may not be so visible. But that's the exception, not the rule. This process of differentiation is why so many relationships end after a year or two, because that's when it really begins in earnest. That's when the new car smell fades away. And either you realize you're not actually that into your partner and you don't really have a lot in common after all, or you don't want the same things in life, or maybe you do, but the work it would take to get to a better place in that relationship just feels insurmountable, and the cost benefit there just does not really work out. And I may be speaking out of turn here, but it seems to me this process is more difficult in kink because we have a third party we need to differentiate ourselves from simultaneously. I'm not really sure if this is a proper way to think about it, so, people that have master's degrees in psychology, let me know. But I believe that we also need to differentiate ourselves from the community's expectations of what our relationship needs to look like. This can cause even more tension than differentiating from the person we're actually in a relationship with. Some of us deeply absorb the idea that we must do this or that thing in our relationship, that we have to use titles or have punishments or play a certain number of times every month or use certain toys. But letting go of that is where the real magic happens. But how do you start that process of consciously differentiating and exploring? My initial suggestion here is going to sound inelegant, but I believe it achieves the best results. And that is to treat your relationship like you are Marie Kondoing your wardrobe. Assume you're going to be keeping nothing as is and just dump everything about your relationship out onto the floor. Maybe not literally, speaking in metaphors here. Go through each piece of your relationship. Go through all of the structure of your DS, your rules. Talk about the fact you have a contract at all, that you have DS at all, and say, does this fulfill me? Do I want this right now? What purpose does this serve? I recommend doing this individually at first. Keep in mind that the point of this exercise is to reestablish a sense of self in the relationship, and also to avoid big compromises that are eventually going to chafe once again. Keep a document or some kind of list to keep track of what you do want, what you need, and what you want to drop from your relationship. Then, when you're both ready, talk about it. For some folks, this is going to be a marathon weekend event, and you're going to spend the whole time going through your relationship from top to bottom, forgive the pun. Or, for others, it's going to take more time. You're going to need to have more time to reflect on answers to questions like, what do I want? Not just what my partner wants me to want, but what do I want? It may be worth it to revisit old podcasts, books, journals you kept, or videos you watched earlier on in your journey, and then check in about your feelings on those subjects now. You can go through a yes, no, maybe checklist again, or go to parties and events you might not have ever considered were for you. Told you, that is. That's another way you can do this. Check out that femdom night. Go to the service dinner. Go to the Littles Munch and chat people up. Maybe what was once a solid no, absolutely not, no way, no how, is now more of a maybe. And if you can, talk to people who have been through this before. I promise you, they're out there. In my time in the scene, I've known many couples who have gone through this process and they didn't even know it. The course of a DS relationship is much less like, and then they found their dream dom or their dream sub and they lived together forever in complete harmony. And it's much more commonly like this. Yeah, we were totally into 24/7 DS at one point. I mean, remember that, honey? It seems so funny now that we used to get so hot just thinking about rules. I mean, oh my gosh. That was before I discovered my switch side, of course. And it took some work, but we were able to get through it, and we found a balance that really works for both of us. The rules are still there, of course, but to be honest, it's mostly just there so we have an excuse to spank each other. Many folks start out being very certain of what they want, only to change their mind later with experience and time. This frequently takes the form of aspiring to high-level DS, only to eventually decide that's not really what you wanted. Then you end up going down to low or no DS at all for a while, and then eventually you settle on some kind of in-between ground of power exchange that's functional long-term for all involved parties. It can be scary to think of your relationship changing so drastically. Trust me, I get it. Especially if you've been using a lot of your energy towards keeping the relationship TM going. Try keeping in mind that this process is ultimately for the greater good. Ending or altering a relationship isn't the worst outcome possible. Continuing to invest time in a relationship that isn't making you happy or fulfilled is. Focus on the fact that this is a time to truly, deeply connect with your partner, not just as the sub or the dom or whatever else, but as a real, vulnerable person. You might be surprised by what revelations you have about yourself and your partner going through this, and those revelations can make your relationship more vibrant than the framework you originally started with. Maybe you end up with a relationship that only has a whisper of DS left, or maybe you finally confess that DS isn't really what you need, and you start working towards an MS relationship instead. Despite the way I've talked about it in this video so far, these conversations are not always about downgrading your power exchange. It can also be about taking that leap of faith and asking for more in your relationship and wanting to go deeper and maybe darker. This book has many guideposts you can use to tell if you're on the right track. I promise I'm not sponsored. They don't know I'm even alive, I'm pretty sure. Things like being able to respect your partner's privacy, understanding you can't ever know all of their thoughts and feelings, being able to approach topics with questions and curiosity, and not being preoccupied solely with the other person's needs and wants are good things to look out for. And that last one especially goes for both sides of the slash. Sorry, Doms, I can tell you're watching. You can't hide behind that, I just want to help my submissive girl. Oh God, please don't look too closely at me. Shtick anymore, okay? No more of that. And subs, you too. No more of this, whatever will please my master type stuff. You have time for that later if you decide you really want to have a relationship where that's how it works. And if you think you have to act like that to find anyone who wants to have a power exchange relationship with you, it's time to slow down and check in before you pursue anything with anyone. And I could make a whole video talking about how to have a DS relationship without rules or contract, but the short answer is believing in the spirit of this. One is the follower and one is the leader. And use that as a guide for your decision-making process. That, at the end of the day, is the beating heart of DS. the rules and paperwork and contracts and everything else are just tools that are used to make following that intention easier and hotter for a lot of people, if I'm being honest. But I hope this video really helped you all understand a little bit more about some of the struggles that can happen in DS relationships and that big blank area that we don't oftentimes talk about, where you want to be in a relationship, you want to be with your partner, but for whatever reason, something is chafing at you and you're trying to figure out, is it the DS? Is it the person? Am I not meant to be kinky? Is something wrong with me? Because that is not always what it's about. And I somewhat expect this to be controversial because I think there is a tension that can exist between independence and submission, and the process of differentiating is all about recognizing your individuality while staying in a relationship. It's actually like a really good illustration in this book. I'm gonna try and find it real quick. Oh, here it is. It's right here. Okay, there's like a really good illustration in this book, and this is what we're aiming for. Even in DS, I really think this is where we should aim. Now, we could have more overlap. It could be really overlap. It could be like 50-50 each way. This is just a random drawing, a random book. But I think this does show how you can have a relationship where you exist independently and you have your own ideas and thoughts and feelings, but you can also exist in DS. And I do want to say as well, this is not for every single DS relationship. Obviously, there are people that exist in DS relationships where there's no romance, no dating. It's purely about the DS and it's much more functional and less personal. Or you have relationships that are intended from the very start and both people involved want it to always be very, very high level, where the intention is for the submissive to completely subsume themselves within the relationship and to not have their own independent wants and desires and thoughts and feelings. I want to recognize that that is in fact a thing that does exist. It is also valid. However, I think a lot of people fantasize about that. They think they want it. They think all DS has to be that way. And then they get a year or two into a dynamic and they realize they can't keep doing that anymore. And that doesn't mean that they're not doing DS or aren't kinky. So that's really the goal of this. I'm not trying to invalidate like any other level or flavor of DS. I really just want to talk about what I think is a plurality of experiences in DS relationships from what I've observed. But please let me know your thoughts and feelings in a comment down below. This was very fun for me to make. This book again is called Hot and Unbothered, and it is by Yana Talon Hicks, which is like a very name. It's a very, very cool name. I got this at the bookstore. Again, not sponsored. This is my own personal copy. Check it out if you want to. It's got great insights in it for all kinds of relationships. And thank you all so much for watching. If you did enjoy this and are ready, please do subscribe because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of kink and BDSM related topics. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best way you can do that is with Patreon. A link to that will be down below. Patreon is why I was able to afford to buy a teleprompter, which I used for the first time on this video. I had like a trial run on Patreon that I did a separate video for them. It's actually about 50 Shades of Grey and reflecting on the impact of 50 Shades of Grey now that it's been around for a decade and a half at this point, if you can believe it. It's quite a long and fun video if you want to check that out. But let me know what you're thinking about the teleprompter, I guess. If you guys could tell I was using it, you guys could probably see my eyes going back and forth, which I hope it's not too much of a problem, but it makes this so much easier, and I think I can do bigger and better videos this way. So thank you so much. If you are supporting me over on Patreon, it means the absolute world to me. Thank you for supporting this work, and until I see you all next time, stay safe out there, and I will talk to you all again very soon.